Chapter 4 of Home, Part 1. The clang of steel against steel rang out in the crisp air outside of Titus's manor as Pontius exchanged blows with his sparring partner. Their hooves danced back and forth across the dirt of the practice yard, kicking up little puffs of dust with every step that drifted in the breeze. Sometimes one Pegasus would leap into the air, straining his wings to pull off aerobatic dodges or feints, and the dust cloud would grow thicker when he fell back to the ground. Rarity couldn't help but lean away every time they did so, but it made little difference. She had been sure to seat herself upwind. She had never been a mare particularly interested in the martial arts. They were barbaric practices from barbaric times, and it was more than unbecoming for a lady such as herself to partake in them. When Whitehorn had suggested coming out to watch Pontius training, her first reaction had been one of disgust. She wanted nothing to do with Titus or his son or such a display. But he had insisted. She couldn't shut herself away in her rooms all day. There were still ponies who needed her, and she had to get back into motion. They needed to talk about their next steps. Good arguments all. She had relented, but brought a book with her. She was still carrying Crazy Rich's copy of The Count of Monte Cristo, and it would serve as a pleasant distraction, if needed. Whitehorn sighed as he settled in next to her, reclining in the shade of the orange cloth canopy they were sharing. Fine weather, don't you think? It was nice of the Duke to give the workers the day off. Rarity pursed her lips.
I doubt niceness has anything to do with it, frankly.
Whitehorn chuckled. You don't give him enough credit, Countess. He nearly died in that battle, you know.
And he nearly killed my friend!
Rarity snapped, turning sharply to face the other unicorn. He had forgone his vest today, perhaps because of the heat of the sun, and was only wearing a white shirt.
Did you bring me here so you could try to change my opinion on the bastard that's trapped me here? No offense to you, darling, but I'm not fond of having my time wasted like that.
Whitehorn arched a brow at that. My lady, you do realize that the Duke is our ally, correct?
Ally?
Rarity curled her lip as she spat the word.
I want nothing to do with him, and neither should you. I would have thought you were better than this.
And I know you're smarter than this. She shot him a disbelieving look, and he raised a hoof to ward off a rebuttal. Rarity, please, listen to me. The Duke isn't normally the sort of person that ponies like you or I would associate with. That is true. He is hard, selfish, and lacking in empathy.
And grace, and decorum, and even a sliver of fashion sense.
Whitehorn dipped his head. Yes, and those. But what he does have is power and influence, something that we need. Now, he may be doing it for the wrong reasons, but ultimately, he's still helping to make the world a better place. And that makes him our ally, and someone you should treat with respect. Rarity clenched her jaw, staring him down with ears back against her head. Was it immature for her to hold a grudge like this, when it couldn't do anything but harm her? Titus was despicable in nature, but fate had seen fit to align their interests, and it would be foolish of her to continue jeopardizing his continued aid as long as that remained true. She tossed her mane.
I don't like it.
I've had to work with many ponies who I don't like in the past, Whitehorn said, sometimes even after they wronged me. It feels dirty at first, but once it's all said and done, and you're finally able to cast them aside and move on to greater things, well, it's all worth it in the end. He smiled. I'm not asking you to like him, or even to enjoy working with him, but I am asking you to show him the respect that he doesn't show you. At least until we don't need him anymore. Do it for Equestria. Rarity's tail flicked side to side as she heaved a sigh. Of course, he was right. She closed her eyes and thought of the soot-stained ponies of Highton, the refugees drowning in Fellas, and the tired villagers that had worn their best threadbare clothes to her wedding. She could draw strength from that. If it was what they needed, and it was, then she could give Titus a cooperative partner. At least for now.
How long?
Rarity asked.
Until we don't need him.
Whitehorn let out a thoughtful hum. No more than a couple months, thankfully. Once we get the Altalucian vote in Parliament, his part of the bargain is over. You can treat him how you will after that.
His part?
Rarity asked. Her ears twitched at the sound of the two Pegasi stomping back and forth in the dirt.
What did you promise him in return?
The Altalucian Prefecture, Whitehorn said. Someone has to manage the gifted at the local level, and I promised him the title once we get the table put into place. He imagines they'll be establishing a new dynasty of Altalucian kings. Rarity opened her eyes, turning to frown at him.
The title would pass to Pontius? It sounds like you actually are promising him a kingdom.
She fidgeted in place.
Would that really make life any better here for the common pony, darling?
Whitehorn answered with an apologetic smile. At first, perhaps not. But Altalucia's sacrifice will give ponies across Equestria an old harmony that they don't even remember missing. Once we have that base, we can work to spread that harmony everywhere.
I see.
Rarity frowned as she watched Pontius exchange blows with his tutor. The blades attached to their wings were dulled with strips of rubber to prevent injury. The tutor ducked backwards, egging Pontius on, and laughed as the colt pressed to the attack. A grin flickered on Pontius's face for just a moment, breaking through his mask of concentration.
And I think I see how I can make sure it happens here sooner rather than later.
Whether it was cultish infatuation or chivalrous ideals, Pontius wanted to impress her. With some careful guidance and encouragement, she could turn him from the path of his father and mold him into a shining paragon of nobility. By the time the brute Titus finally passed away, and good riddance to him, a kind lord would be ready to take the reins.
And when I let the Duke's line end with no heir, all of his efforts will be for naught.
Rarity couldn't help but smile at the thought. As much as she may like to imagine raising a beautiful family with her true love, she had no intent of bearing grandfuls for the stallion who had trapped her. She would take his son and turn him to her side, and he would regret the day he thought to own her.
I'm glad you convinced me to come out here, Whitehorn.
She stood up and tossed her mane, giving her companion a warm smile.
With the two of us working together, there's no force that can prevent the creation of a better Equestria. What's our next move?
Whitehorn grinned up at her. It's good to see the dour expression that's been haunting your beautiful face for the past 2 days replaced with your usual gusto, my lady. Parliament will be convening at harvest soon, and we have to be sure that the island is united enough to send a delegate that will support us. Titus has called a meeting with several other nobles for tomorrow.
Exquisite.
Rarity turned to the training ring and saw that the two Pegasi had settled down in the shade of the manor for a break.
I'll be sure to attend. For now, I think it's best I begin to apply myself to the situation at Hoof. Ta-ta for now, my sweet.
She strutted out from under the canopy, allowing the sunlight to glitter against the white gown she had adorned before leaving her rooms. Pontius looked up at the movement, and she caught his eye with a toss of her mane and a gentle smile. He blushed, looking away and dipping his head into the trough of water he and his mentor were leaning on. The mentor followed his gaze to Rarity and let out a deep belly laugh as she approached. Chin up, lad. How do you expect to keep troops in line at battle when you turn tail at the sight of your own mare? Pontius shook his wet mane as he pulled his head out of the trough and took in a deep breath. I don't know what you're talking about, Master. You always tell me to be careful about overheating, so I'm being careful. Of course you are. The older stallion stood up and greeted Rarity with a nod as she reached the duo. Sir Itrix, the lads talked much of you today. Rarity dipped into a prim curtsy. She'd been expecting a far rougher countenance from a murder instructor.
Countess Rarity, I certainly hope it's all good things.
Itrix grinned. He was wearing a padded orange vest with a brown cloth shirt beneath, and the burnt red fur on his face was marred by multiple scars. I certainly ain't the kind of stallion that would betray his nephew even if he didn't.
Oh, you're related?
Rarity looked between them, seeing the similarity now that she was up close. Aye. Titus knows I won't go easy on the lad just to keep pay flowing, Itrix said, and he knows he ain't got half my experience when it comes to teaching the younger and eager to defend themselves. Rarity turned to Pontius with an encouraging smile, hoping to make up for some of her previous attitude. But he wouldn't meet her eyes.
Perhaps a more direct approach. So this is the pony responsible for teaching you how to defend me, then?
He seemed to straighten up some at that, but he kept his gaze to the side. Aye, my lady.
Then I owe you my thanks, my lord.
Rarity dipped into a low bow towards Itrix.
Sir Pontius has proven himself to be a stalwart guardian since I arrived on Alta Lucia.
Itrix arched a brow, and he didn't bother to hide the skepticism in his voice. He turned and nudged the blushing colt with a huff. All right, break time's over, stalwart guardian. Let's show her some more of your moves. The two stallions stretched their wings as they trotted back onto the tramped down dirt. Pontius glanced back her way, and Rarity fluttered her eyelashes at him, causing him to stumble over his own hooves. By the time she settled back into her seat, they were in the middle of another bout. Itrix called out taunting tidbits of advice between blows, and Rarity smirked when she realized that Pontius was putting in more effort than before. No doubt he was trying very hard to impress her. Rarity glanced towards her book, but didn't pick it up. Even if she wasn't interested in the martial arts, there was still much she could learn from watching.
We need a plan.
Twilight paced back and forth across the little ruined kitchen that had become her base of operations.
We have to get back into motion. Oh, taking the initiative at last?
Midnight paused long enough to sink its teeth into the changeling steak before it.
Perhaps I'm finally rubbing off on you. Not too much, I hope.
Midnight's only answer was a low, amused chuckle. Twilight started another lap around the room, idly licking the greasy flavor from her lips. She was finally beginning to feel like she had her hooves under her once more, and with that feeling returned the steadily growing sense that she was wasting precious time. What had she done since arriving in Canterlot, aside from bouncing between anger, despair, and self-loathing? Equestria still needed her, and she didn't even know how long she had spent feeling sorry for herself in the pits of its gravestone. 6 wakings? 7? She had neglected to pay attention after eating the first steak, and time had slipped by unnoticed as she watched Midnight gorge themselves on the rest of the changeling, pausing only to fetch more books from the archives, or prepare the next meal while the previous one digested. The kitchen had grown clogged with books, leaving only narrow pathways between the rubble and stacked texts. She had raided the archives for books on magic theory, time travel, changelings, mythology, exotic monsters, mental maledictions, and so much more, but to no avail. She had then turned to the court logs, stepping gingerly through the narrow corridors that once housed the castle bureaucrats, and confirmed her fears. The city had been abandoned on the day of the royal wedding, or soon after. There were no records of anything after that. Now she had run out of food, and it was clear that the royal archives held no answers for her. She bit her lip at the thought of all the knowledge that must have been left behind. Would things have turned out differently had the researchers in the Golden Oaks library had access to all that accumulated knowledge? Perhaps she and her friends could have saved the city, and those texts could have saved the land. Another straw of guilt settled onto her back. She couldn't sit still any longer. The very thought of rest was enough to stir a breathy nausea in the back of her throat. But what did she do now? She closed her eyes, poring through her last memories from the past. Even now it was still a blurry, jumbled mess, brief flashes of emotion and moments all tangled together.
Princess Celestia!
Twilight gasped, eyes snapping open as a brief spark of memory returned to her. She turned to see Midnight watching her curiously. It arched a brow.
I remembered something,
Twilight said. Her horn glowed as she approached one of the collapsed walls, and the heavy stones twinkled under the embrace of her magic. Forming a temporary path through the rubble was a simple task, now that she was properly fed. Midnight was already waiting when Twilight stepped out into the hall.
Care to share, little flower?
Twilight started down the hall at a brisk trot. She lit the way ahead with a glowing ball of lavender light that cast its glow over the cracked stones and rotten carpet, while a steady series of pings assured her of no danger ahead. Still, she kept her voice low.
The Hall of Unions. That's where the wedding was being held. And?
Midnight didn't walk alongside Twilight, instead preferring to simply appear out of the darkness in front of her. Its voice faintly echoed in the distance.
Are you expecting to find something there? I don't know,
Twilight whispered back.
But it's all I have. Oh, you know that isn't true, my dear Blossom.
Midnight cooed.
You always have me.
Twilight rolled her eyes, but otherwise didn't dignify the honeyed words with a response. It was obvious to any visitor from a glance that Kennerlock Castle was a truly massive feat of architecture and engineering. But Twilight had never truly appreciated its size until years into her tutelage there. It was easy to look up at its towering spires and glittering windows in awe, but only the servants, soldiers, and staff ever grew to understand just how truly expansive it was. It had taken years for Twilight to memorize the layout, and even then, the oldest servants could get lost in the abandoned levels deep below. The Hall of Unions was on the eastern side of the castle, facing the rising sun, and luckily, close to the kitchen she had been staying in. It only took her a few minutes to reach it at her pace, and much of that was from backtracking out of blocked paths. Memories of foalhood came to Twilight as she walked. Even without the bustle that once filled the halls, even with the world reduced to the little circle of lavender she carried with her, she could still recognize it. There was the dining hall where the Griffin delegates had been entertained, and there, the servant quarters where she had hid from her brother the last time they had played hide-and-seek. But those were dead memories, and not the ones she was looking for. And so she pressed on. The double doors of the Hall of Unions swung wide open, inviting her in. She sent her orb light before her, and it rose up into the arched ceiling, spreading its dim light over the room. Twilight gasped, raising a hoof to her muzzle.
Oh my.
Midnight chuckled.
And I was beginning to wonder whether anyone had ever died in this pitiful castle.
Pony skeletons, their last hanging strips of flesh hidden behind dented royal guard armor and congealed changeling goo, rested side by side with the empty, cracked husks of dead changelings. The torn remains of streamers hung alongside gaping changeling pods, their open bellies drooping with age. Black scorch marks stained the walls and floor like arcs of lightning, all converging in a jagged circle next to a tarnished golden tiara adorned with a pale magenta gem.
Princess Celestia!
Twilight nearly tripped as she remembered watching her mentor crash to the ground. She remembered the look of triumph on Chrysalis's face, the sneer in her voice as she crowed her victory over the princess. She remembered rushing to Celestia's side and shivering at the feebleness of her voice.
The elements of harmony. You must get to them.
Twilight slumped to the floor next to the tiara. She reached out a hoof, but stopped just short of it. Celestia had fallen here, in this very place, just 1,000 years ago. She could almost see it still, back when the sun still shone in through the windows and the tiles had been freshly polished. She almost couldn't bring herself to touch it. It belonged to the princess. She must have left it behind for a reason. But no. Celestia wouldn't have dropped it on the floor to rest askew for 1,000 years. Perhaps she was missing it. Looking around, Twilight tore a strip of fabric from an old streamer and wrapped it around the tiara. She pulled it as tight as she dared before forming the cloth into a simple sash and slipping it over her head. The weight of the gold against her chest was oddly comforting.
Oh, you are just disgusting,
Midnight hissed.
Are we done here?
Twilight sighed, climbing back to her hooves and glaring at her other half.
We are going to find the elements of harmony. They could still be in the city. You think your ponies would have left their most powerful artifacts behind?
Midnight let the question hang for a few seconds, before continuing with a wicked grin.
Well, I suppose maybe. If they're as foolish as you, then perhaps. Ugh. Do you really have to insult me with every word?
Twilight growled as she turned for the door. She paused to take a closer look at one of the changeling bodies, and noted the lack of monstrous mutations.
No, but I do so enjoy it,
Midnight said sweetly.
What are friends for, after all?
Stepping out into the hall, Twilight checked her surroundings before picking a direction. The tiara bounced against her chest with every step.
You're not my friend. Friends are there to support each other. Ah, yes, and we know that I never do that, do I?
Midnight hovered on the edges of Twilight's vision, whispering into her ears.
No, for I am the villain. I protect us when we're in danger and strike down those who would do us harm and prevent us from wasting away into bone and fur. No good friend would commit such acts. You take over my body and hurt others against my will,
Twilight countered. If the elements were still in Canterlot, then they should be stored in the Hall of Relics, which was a separate tower from the royal grounds. She would have to brave the open ground outside the castle.
Tell me, little flower, but what is a good friend to do when they see you on the brink of death?
Midnight snorted, sending a chill down Twilight's spine as if she had just walked through some phantom wind.
Would a good friend have left you to die to that winged flame, drowning in your own delusions? A good friend wouldn't have killed Philomena!
Twilight snapped. She stiffened as her sudden outburst echoed through the cavernous chambers of the castle, and for a moment she imagined some ghostly filly running through the corridors, chasing after the phoenix during a study break. Twilight took a deep breath, keeping her voice under control.
A good friend wouldn't have forced me to kill. One day you'll understand. You'll thank me for all the times I've kept us alive.
They reached a tall, rectangular window, and Twilight paused. She knew that this window would lead her out onto the battlements, and from there she could cross to the tower which held the Hall of Relics. But that would mean going out into the open. She would have to snuff out her light and navigate the wall by feel if she wanted to avoid getting spotted. But then she might fall off. Midnight's cackling laughter rang in her ears.
Us fear the darkness. I can put an end to that foolishness.
Twilight stiffened, glancing around nervously. She could feel its dark nature tickling at her eyelids.
What are you talking about? Let me make us better, as I have before,
Midnight whispered.
We shouldn't be lurking in the shadows like prey. No.
Twilight kept her voice firm.
I don't want you making any more changes. For now, maybe.
Flicking her tail in annoyance, Twilight released the magic of her light and plunged herself into total darkness. For a moment, Twilight felt herself back within the grip of a changeling pod, her limbs swathed in dark resin and her muscles submerged in the freezing goo. She shook her head, and the sensation passed. Taking a deep breath, Twilight pushed the window open and crept over the threshold. She was completely deprived of sight without her horn to see by, and so she was forced to slide forwards inch by inch, testing every step for solid ground before taking it. She crouched low at the sound of a dragon roaring in the distance, which was joined seconds later by a chorus of changeling shrieks. A gout of green flame flared up over the rooftops, giving Twilight a brief glimpse of the ruined city silhouetted against its glare, before she was forced to tear her eyes, sensitive to light after so long in the dim, away.
Spike!
She waited for a few seconds, giving her eyes time to adjust before cracking them open once more. Lashes of flickering green fire cast the city in a harsh light, silhouetting the crooked towers as if against a sickly sunrise. She crouched low, keeping herself hidden behind the crenellations in case any changelings were able to pick her out with the light, and crawled further down the wall. Another dragon roar rocked the city, causing a loose stone to dislodge itself somewhere nearby, before falling to the ground with a loud crack. As much as she would have denied it if asked, it was true that she had largely forgotten about Spike since leaving Canterlot. Perhaps forgotten wasn't the best word, but she'd been so caught up in other things, in the fate of Equestria and her other friends, that she had never found the time to consider him. Now that she was here, however, she had the opportunity. Whatever affliction had afflicted the rest of the Equestrians before the apocalypse, Spike seemed to have fallen victim to it as well. And with all the advanced magic books in Canterlot, surely she could find some way to cure him. She had books, time, and a robust understanding of the scientific method. No problem could withstand her for long. The corner of her lips curled up into a little smile at the thought of speaking with her #1 assistant again. No doubt he would be distraught at first, but together they could overcome. She could help him come to terms with his new body, and he could tell her everything he knew about what had happened in her absence. Was the tunnel out of Canterlot big enough to fit an adult dragon?
Getting ahead of ourselves, aren't we?
Midnight asked. It let out a dramatic sigh.
You don't even know if you can save him. Of course I can save him,
Twilight whispered back.
I have to.